What's up, everybody? I'm John Middlekauff. You know what I need you to do. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We got content for days reacting to every NFL game all the time, every single day. Subscribe, like the videos. Let's go. George Foreman passed away. And I think there are certain people with every generation that you know, not for what actually made them famous, right? Like John Madden. I don't remember when I learned that he was actually a coach, but it was well after I knew John Madden as being the guy with the video game and that called, 49er games and Packer games and Cowboy games. That was a superstar on Fox. Then you're like, as you get older, honestly, it might have been a decade. It might have been until I was after high school that you're like, oh, this guy used to coach for the Raiders. Right? This guy was a legendary Raider coach in the 70s. But when you're coming up in the 90s, all you know is like, this is one of the most unique individuals ever on my television and my favorite video game. And I think George Foreman, for people in my generation, is known as the guy with the grill, not as the guy that was part of what many would consider, I don't know where you would rank it, but probably the most famous fight of all time. Definitely one of the biggest fights in the history of the sport, the Rumble in the Jungle against Muhammad Ali. And George Foreman then parlayed that to become one of the great businessmen, I would say definitely in the 90s, but you could argue in the history of former athletes. And I just want to read you that really quick. I've always still had this theory because I'm a good example of I make my money with the modern day technology internet. Because of the cell phone, I'm able to monetize my profession. If that 20 years ago, this didn't even exist. I couldn't have and make a living off what I do now. It would have been in radio, and I would have had to move city to city or figure out a way, right? But because of technology, which I'm very grateful for, and it has its downfalls, social media, you name it. But without social media, the phone, and those things, I would not be sitting here today being able to do this. I've always thought that, and listen, I think the internet and everything that's going on, like I try to be a glass half full guy and be positive with everything that's associated with and be optimistic about its future, even though it can drive us all nuts. If you are famous now because of the internet, doesn't mean you're not famous. You could have millions of people follow you on social media and you can make a ton of money, quote unquote, being an influencer. But you could be a person making millions of dollars that me, that you have no clue even exists. I do think that was really hard to do pre-internet. And the fame of people pre-internet was just dramatically bigger than what it is now. Because if you were famous in the 50s or the 60s, Elvis Presley, John Wayne, Frank Sinatra, everyone knew who you were. When I was a kid, people like Michael Jackson, Michael Jordan, whoever, right? Obviously athletes, but musicians, the Kennedys, you name it. You could go into any walk of life. I could knock on every single door walking down the street. And every person that opened their door on my block, on the block down the street, would know exactly who Michael Jackson was, or Robert F. Kennedy was, or Elvis Presley was. Now there are people you'd be like, hey, this person's making $20 million. They're a Bravo star. You and me couldn't point them out of a lineup. And honestly, some of these I could now because Maria's wrote me in, but there are these people in all these different walks of life because of the internet that has changed the world. And George Foreman's fame in the 90s is something that we don't really see anymore. And sometimes I miss it. It's like we hear about shows, and there are some shows that I would say cross over, but like for the most part in the 80s or the 90s, everyone watched the same shows and we all had opinions on the same thing that we were all watching. It's what makes football so unique. It's the only thing in America now that can consistently get 15, 20, 30 million people all sitting down at the same time and consuming. That doesn't happen anymore, which is just part of modern day society. But I saw what's funny is, I don't know when it was, but maybe a week ago, I saw something on George Foreman on Instagram. And it was an interview series that he did with that Graham guy that has like the internet He's also, I think, on, I forget what channel he's on, but he interviews a bunch of famous former athletes, and they were breaking down how much money George Foreman was making off the grill. And I was blown away. I knew the grill was a really big deal. And then over the last 24 hours, once he passed away, I kind of just did some deep diving. One stat I saw on the George Foreman grill is that it was estimated between 12 to 15% of America had the George Foreman grill. And this is just from Wikipedia, but it's pretty crazy how big George Foreman turned this grill into. And if you are, I would say 25 or under, you have it's hard for you to comprehend how universally agreed upon every person just had a George Foreman grill in their house. I don't remember many people that I grew up around not having it. And definitely as you got to college in the early to mid 2000s, it was a staple of every house, mainly because it just worked and it was really easy. I mean, it's actually one of the more practical inventions in recent memory. And then doing the deep dive, you realize that like all these other celebrities tried to copy it. Evander Holyfield had this thing like the lean mean grilling machine. Clearly that didn't work. Jackie Chan tried one. A bunch of famous people tried it. But nothing was like this. And the worldwide popularity of the George Foreman grill has resulted in sales, this is from Wiki, of over 100 million units since it first launched. I chat GPT'd it because I couldn't remember, and it's a long time ago, how much George Foreman grills were going for. And there were different models, but basically $49.99 to $89.99, selling over 100 million units. Although Foreman never confirmed exactly how much he earned from his endorsement, Sultan Inc. paid him 138 million dollars in 1999 in order to buy out the right to use his name. So in 1999, this invention started in the early, I think 93 or 94, and he had gotten royalties of it over those 6 or 7 years. And then in 1999, he was paid $138 million. I mean, it's a big deal now when Myles Garrett gets $130 million. $138 million in 1999. But here's the thing. Previous to that, he was being paid about 40% of the profits of each grill sold, earning him about $4.5 million a month at its peak. So there was a period of time, whether it was a year, a couple years, he was making 4 to 5. And he said on the Instagram thing, he's like, I was making $5 million a month. And then eventually bought out for $140 million. So it's estimated he made well over $200 million from his endorsement, a sum that is substantially more than he earned as a boxer. Obviously, he didn't earn that much as a boxer because in the 70s, they weren't paying big freights. But George Foreman was a guy he lost to Ali, and he never got a rematch, which was kind of crazy. But beat Joe Frazier, who obviously had some legendary fights with Muhammad Ali as well. But I think when we talk about influencers, and that's just a trendy term because it's real. I mean, there are people that push a lot of product as just quote unquote influencers on YouTube, on Instagram, on TikTok. I mean, there's part of our show that there's an influencer element, but that's just the nature of the business in as a podcaster, which used to be radio of the audio medium. But just someone who doesn't have a podcast or a TV star or whatever, I'm just a human and I'm just pushing a product. You could argue George Foreman's one of the greatest salesmen in the history of America. And the business deal that, whether he decided it, whether his manager did it to originally get that 40% of the profits to then parlay that into the power of his name. But like this product not only worked, everyone had it. Honestly, 15% feels a little low. At least in my life, whether it be growing up or whether it being college. And the other thing that the grill had is it like crossed all demos. Like some items in life, right, are for either higher income households, lower income households, like whether you were rich, whether you were middle class, whether you were poor. Like this fucking thing was a must have. And RIP to a champion. Back it was before my time, but heavyweight boxing, I mean, how badass, how famous these guys that were just massive throwing blows. It's just kind of it's dead. But one of the greatest entrepreneurs in the history of professional athletes.